Thanks. I'm so glad all of you guys could come out and want to learn about this topic. It's not one that a lot of people get excited about, but it's something I'm very passionate about because I've just seen how healing it can be when we have a firm understanding of trauma and how we can actually support kids through it and heal and grow so they can reconnect with themselves. I'm curious a little bit, what was it maybe that brought, I know you guys are kind of eating so your mouths are full, but what brought you to today's talk, if anything? Maybe just curiosity or what? Go ahead.
Angela and I work for a mentoring program called Save Our Youth, so we match adult mentors with at-risk kids, and a lot of our kids in our program have been through some type of trauma in their life.
Okay.
And that's pretty much a daily basis of working through that with a lot of our staff, and so we'd like to just know more about it.
Yeah, okay, great. That's wonderful. Thank you for your work. That's amazing stuff. Anyone else?
We work with a safe house that focuses on girls aged 12 to 16 that are being rescued from sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always wanting to hear and learn more.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Cool. Anyone else?
We work with kids ministry at our church, and it seems like more and more of your kids that you're dealing with have experienced trauma, and you don't necessarily know what they've dealt with or what they're experiencing, but how to effectively help them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's wonderful. I'm glad that you came. I'm glad all of you came. Anyone else want to share? Okay. Cool. Oh, go ahead.
So I work at a private Christian pre-K through 12 school.
Oh, great.
And typically Christian schools can become very isolated
Yeah.
from the world around them, and we're trying not to do that. But we realize that when we want the kids to be a part of the wider world, it can be really messy. Trying to figure out how to, especially for our younger children,
Okay. All right.
have them be engaged with the world around them, but in ways that don't traumatize them.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
My first career was in law enforcement. Did a lot of work with families and children that had been victimized. And now I work pastoral staff at a church. And seeing some of it there.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Claire's our youth pastor, and so we're seeing stuff.
Yeah.
Causes some
Okay.
wonder.
Yeah. I think it's hard. I think somewhat we're having more awareness that this could be a trauma response. And then I think some of the insulating factors to not have a traumatic reaction aren't maybe as present in our society. And so we're having more of the PTSD because the resiliency factors maybe aren't in place. So, gosh, there's a lot of different factors that come into play, for sure. Okay, well, I'm just going to kind of get started. And there's so much that we can talk about, as you can imagine, about trauma. And so I'm really going to kind of just skim the surface here today in our brief time together. And I encourage you, if something I'm explaining is not clear, just let me know. You can put your hand up, and I'd love to just clarify. Sometimes I can get into my own world of using different parts of the brain or something, like different terms that maybe just are not really common. And so I just, maybe if for some reason that happened, just let me know. So first I just want to talk about our body's unconscious regulatory system. It's called our autonomic nervous system. And so it's something that happens in milliseconds. And we don't have any control over it kicking in. And that kicks in when we perceive a stressor in our environment, a threat to our well-being. And so what can happen, there's several different phases here, but I'm going to demonstrate this just with a simple kind of illustration here. So imagine that there's a gazelle in the wild and a lion is perceived in the distance. At first, the gazelle will probably freeze for a moment just to perceive what exactly is happening. And then what you might see is the lion starts chasing the gazelle. And at that point, the gazelle is in a full-out fight or flight reaction. And we as humans also experience this fight or flight. And what that looks like is all the blood flow goes to our muscles so that we can be really strong and run really fast. Our pupils dilate, and actually our eyes slightly go outward so we can perceive our surroundings. Our heartbeat goes really fast. Our airways open so we can breathe really well. And non-essential functions like our immune system, our digestion, even sexual kind of reproduction kind of functions go offline so that all of our energy can be in just keeping ourselves alive, right? So you'll see in this kind of run where the gazelle just runs for about 50 seconds, and it's either, they're a goner or they get away free, okay? So that fight or flight is meant to be really quick, that we're in it and either we're not gonna make it through or we're through it and we are coming to safety, okay? So, and that part of the brain that's responsible for that fight or flight is called the reptilian brain. It's the brain stem, and it just kind of, it's very primal. When you're in fight or flight, running from a tiger, right? You don't stop and think, should I go behind that tree, or should I go over this, or should I go into, you just go, right? So there's not that part of your brain where you can think logically and rationally and reason. There's not any blood flow going there. You can't think very clearly. You're just getting the heck out of Dodge. So that's the fight or flight response. And that's also called the sympathetic nervous system, that branch of the nervous system. So after the fight or flight response, I also mentioned that the freeze, and I also call it freeze and appease when we're talking about kids, because this often looks like kids appeasing adults when they feel threatened. But this, I'll call it freeze in the context of this gazelle, is what happens is if the gazelle perceives it's not going to get away, the lion is right there, it's going to eat the gazelle, something else happens. And basically, the brakes are put on the system completely. And it's an extreme parasympathetic response. And what happens in that time is that the body is flooded with opioids, endorphins, all these wonderful chemicals which numb them out. So if they were to be deader, they wouldn't feel it, okay? So that's the way our bodies are made, is to protect us no matter what, to try to take care of our well-being. Oftentimes in this state, they're actually feigning being dead. They may not be dead yet, but you can think of like a mouse that has been caught by a cat, right? Is they'll just go limp. Or you can think about a possum just going limp when there's danger. Often you'll also see this in reptiles, is they'll just freeze. That's what we're talking about here. And your heart rate slows down a whole lot. And basically, again, everything kind of goes offline as you oftentimes dissociate and disconnect from the experience. Kids are more likely to go into the freeze and appease than the fight or flight, right? Because obviously they're a lot smaller. Their systems tell them pretty quickly, I can't fight or flight my way out of this thing. And this isn't a conscious thing that they're thinking through. This is their body's mechanism that is actually choosing which state it's going into. And choosing isn't even the right word, it's just automatically going into that state. So when a person goes into this freeze response, sometimes they'll pass out, right? Sometimes they'll dissociate, and so that means they feel disconnected from their body. Sometimes they'll say that they saw themselves there on the floor, different things like that. And oftentimes they just won't have any recollection of the event at all. Sometimes what this often looks like for kids is, let's say, Jenna's riding her bike down the street and she's going down this really big hill and she's so excited about it, but she flips her handlebars and she goes flying over it. And she's, really beat up, different things like that. And, mom comes and sees that she's not injured or not. She's pretty badly scuffed up, but she's not got any broken bones. And Jenna is just like frozen. She's just like not even crying at this point because this was just really overwhelming for her. And mom is like so happy because she's such a tough cookie. Well, actually, she's probably in the freeze response right now. And she hasn't been able to integrate what happened to her right now. And so it's going to take some time for her. There's probably going to be tears, but not for another 5 or 30 minutes or something until she's been able to come to terms for all those hormones that kicked in that numbed her out for that moment to wear off, for her to realize the pain that's actually in her body. And so, as you can imagine, caregivers can sometimes shut that down, that response of actually, after the event, letting a child to be able to cry, to have that space afterwards to come back to homeostasis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So finally, if a child, let's say they do go through fight or flight, maybe they even go to freeze and appease, but really where we want to end up in is a homeostasis of rest and digest. Okay, rest and digest is generally where most people are operating out of. And it's really what it sounds like. It's when our body is calm, our blood flow returns to normal, our immune system can go back online, we can socially engage. So I wanted to mention that as well. Really in rest and digest, that's where our social engagement can come back online. When we're running from a tiger, we don't want to socialize or anything like that. That part of the brain is actually offline. And when we're in rest and digest, that's when you get the neocortex, which allows for logic, reasoning, higher order thinking, planning comes back online, where we can inhibit behaviors, things that we know we don't want to do. We have the ability to do so when that part of the brain comes online with rest and digest. So that's kind of the overview of the nervous system, right? Is that when we're in fight or flight or freeze and appease, the parts of our brain that allow us to socially engage or reason and logic our way through life are offline, and we're just very primal in trying to get safe and being in a survival mode, right? And it's only when we come back to rest and digest that we have the ability to regulate ourselves and connect and maybe even be the kids that we want to be when we're talking about kids really specifically. So we are all going through some level of arousal or kind of fight or flight and some level of parasympathetic hypoarousal through our day. If you actually notice your breath, when you inhale, that takes your arousal level up slightly, your heart rate increases slightly. And when you exhale, your heart rate slows down, and that's a subtle way that we shift states. And none of these states are bad, right? Fight or flight or rest or freeze and appease. They have their place, but what happens is we can get stuck in them, or if they happen at a young age, it can really impact brain development, social development, cognitive abilities. So I just wanted to kind of have an illustration of that. The 3 types of stress. So ideally we have a positive type of stress, right? We have some sort of challenge that we encounter, some sort of obstacle. It's mild. And we have someone, for kids, who can help you at the end of the day to come back to calm, right? Tolerable, serious temporary stress responses buffered by supportive relationships. Again, just to notice that there are different kinds of stress. And then toxic levels are when you're in a prolonged activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. What's really key, what I really hope that you guys come away with, is for kids, they are learning their regulation from parents, from their primary caregivers first. That's how they learn how to regulate their emotions. So if a child is dysregulated, oftentimes we really have to connect with them relationally to help bring them back to calm. Okay, so we'll get to more of that here. But I wanted to share this video. It's going to take a moment to load because that's been my experience at least. But I think it's worthwhile, so we'll just give it a second here just to load. to kind of drive this home a little bit differently.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
All right, so before I continue here, I wanted just to check in and see if anyone has any questions just about that basic stress response. If there was anything missing there that you had any questions about.
Just, it's a semantics thing. Are you talking about a child then who has toxic stress and in a kind of state of hypervigilance? Or does that depend on the circumstance?
Excuse me. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more, just talking about development. But the way that I often will think about it is that a child's tendency to stay in the toxic stress, there's different factors, right? If the environment is stressful and it's triggering the traumatic response, then they'll probably stay in that heightened sense of that heightened arousal. If a parent has not taught them how to come back to joy, then they may stay in that space. So there's a lot of different factors there, but I'll get into that a little bit more. So any other questions before? Okay. So I just want to talk about for a moment, like just what healthy attachment or development might look like for an infant. Okay, so we can imagine a home where there's food on the table, the bills are paid, there's not really a lot of stress just around basic survival in the home. Mom is happy and healthy, she's not depressed. And so when the baby cries, mom attunes to the baby. If she needs her diaper changed, she changes the diaper. If the baby's hungry, she feeds the baby. She talks to the baby, probably in these really like sing-songy ways, right? And this baby feels loved and cared for. And basically, in times of stress where they're crying to get their needs met, after every time they cry, pretty much, Mom is right there to say, I'm here, I love you, I'm going to take care of you. What that instills in a baby is, like I said, they don't automatically know how to regulate their difficult emotions in times of stress. The mom is literally teaching the baby how to come back to calm. And it's called interpersonal neurobiology, where it's literally a right brain connection to right brain, where the mom's physiology is impacting the baby to teach the baby how to calm, okay? So as you can imagine, this baby builds hope. They know that if they feel horrible, they're gonna be able to, like, it's gonna get better soon, right? This baby learns trust, that their caregiver is trustworthy, that, you know, adults are there to help them. This baby, also, because of this attunement to their bodies, they can even learn more about their physical sense of awareness, because all their physical needs are being met. They don't numb out from them. So there's all these sorts of lessons that are being learned just in these early interactions in a loving home. So this is building the foundation of emotional resiliency and the ability to tolerate stress and to come back to calm, that rest and digest after a time of either overwhelm or high anxiety. So let's talk for a moment about a neglected baby. So, it could look so many different ways, but I have some slides here just to show some different brains of kids. And so I'll just talk about severe neglect. And so let's just imagine that this baby grew up in an orphanage where there wasn't sufficient caregivers. There wasn't a consistent caregiver. The baby would cry. Maybe their, diaper would be changed when it needed to be. Maybe they would be fed consistently, maybe not. Maybe when they were crying, they would be shaken because they didn't know how to console this baby. And maybe the caregiver was so burnt out, so much stress, so many babies to take care of, that they were depressed. Maybe they had a flat affect with the baby. Maybe there was no sing-song to the voice. Those all impact development. And this child's brain doesn't get stimulation, and it doesn't learn how to come back to calm. Oftentimes, these babies will just go into a freeze response where they won't cry. They'll really try to avoid even being seen sometimes because they've been met with abuse. So as you can imagine, this baby gets a really fearful picture of the world, right? That their needs aren't going to be met. Why try? It's kind of hopeless anyway. People don't care about me. People tend to get kind of a sense that they're bad. Why else would they be treating me this way? And they internalize just a sense of being bad or wrong. And this lack of stimulation from caregivers, they're not learning social cues. They're not learning about, seeing a face that's responsive to their actions. And they're stuck in that stress response that we talked about earlier. So their higher brain development isn't necessarily online to help them engage socially and to grow in their cognitive skills and their executive functioning. So they often will lack body awareness. So I don't know if you have any of those clumsy kids that are just kind of they don't maybe run into things, different things like that. A lot of times it's lacking that stimulation, that touch, positive touch. And so they just don't have that personal awareness. Any questions about just those illustrations?
When you're talking about a baby, what age range are you talking? 0 to 1 year, 0 to 2 years? What age range of development is this?
So it would be 0 to 3. But even, I think really the bottom line is that we learn that we are loved or hope in the world, not through someone teaching us cognitively, right? There's hope in the world, but we learn it through thousands of interactions where love is shown in relationship. And so our brain is growing the most, 0 to 2, and that's really where we get most of the growth in the brain that follows that and the positive repercussions of that. If you have a child that was adopted at 3 into a loving home, there can be that continued growth, but it's thousands of times, right? You can tell the kid 1,000 times you love them, but it's showing them 1,000,000 times that you love them, that actually can be internalized, and they can learn that regulation from you. So I hope I answered your question. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So I just wanted to demonstrate just this. These are the brains of 2 3-year-old children. The image on the left is a healthy child, while the image on the right is from a Romanian orphan who suffered severe sensory deprivation. So they look different, right? They're literally different sized brains. The stress, the cortisol response, and oftentimes will inhibit the growth of these neurons in your brain tissue. And so it literally changes the structure of the brain, this stress response. This is the same brains. And this is just looking at regions of high and low activity. And as I mentioned to you, and this talks at birth, only primitive structures such as the brainstem are fully functional. And that is sight, sound, smell, body sensations, that fight or flight. That's only online for little babes. And the regions like the temporal lobes, which are the neocortex, start wiring with development. So as you can see, there's not a lot of activation in these parts of the brain that help with being able to understand logic, reason, inhibiting behavior that you don't want, different things like that. It hasn't had a chance to grow or wire because this child has been in survival for so long. It's just operating in that brainstem. Any questions? So this just is a kind of illustration of what a typical neuron looks like with many connections. And again, that wash of the toxic kind of stress chemicals and how it can damage neurons and thereby have fewer connections. So I like this illustration here. So far, I haven't really shown with the brain here, but this is the brainstem, the reptilian brain, which is part of that fight or flight, and the freeze response, freeze and appease. This is the limbic system, and that's more related to emotional social engagement, and that tends to come online after you kind of get out of the fight or flight. And then the neocortex is like the new covering of all the other brain parts, and we're talking about these parts. And so these colors coordinate to these different kind of parts of the brain. So for typical development, a child is spending ideally little time in the survival response. Little time and energy there because their mom or caregivers are bringing them into regulation. So they're feeling regulated. Not as much time and energy spent in trying to regulate oneself. But most of their energy can go into that social connection and responding to mom when she's singing to you, smiling. And then as you grow, even as kids, they can start to socialize more and then come to the higher order cognitive skills of reasoning. So as you can see, a child who has been in a lot of that toxic stress is spending almost all their time and energy in survival mode, and they're not able to dedicate their energy into so much these other higher. So next, I just wanted to get into some examples of traumatic events for kids. And I just gave you guys a really exhaustive, well, it's not exhaustive, but a big list there of just different things that could be childhood trauma. And I think the big thing to think about with trauma is that it's subjective to the person who experienced it. So two people could have be in a car accident. One could perceive their life was at risk. They could go into fight or flight. shut down, freeze, dissociate, and have PTSD afterwards. The other person may have perceived they were fine the whole time. Maybe they got into fight or flight, but they realized they were safe pretty quickly. They reconnected with their loved ones really quickly, and they have no symptoms of PTSD. Part of that is genetic. Part of that is your upbringing. Part of it's just your personality. There's a lot of factors there, but I think the big picture is that it's different for everybody. So the psychological effects are likely to be most severe if the trauma is human caused, if there's that repeated, chronic, longer duration, right? You're going to get more of the stress hormones that are going to be flooding your system and impacting the child. If they actually feel like their life was at risk, that's huge. If it happens kind of out of nowhere, if there's a lot of different components to it, if the person is actually wanting to actively hurt them, and I don't know if you guys have ever worked with like ritualistic satanic abuse, like where there's actually cults out there that try to hurt kids, right? For their purposes I won't go into, but if it's undergone in childhood, the earlier it tends to be, has more of a developmental impact or impact on their regulation system. If it involved that freeze response, where they numbed out, that's when you likely tend to see more of the PTSD kind of re-experiencing later on. And it's pretty much the worst when it's perpetrated by a caregiver, right? That's the very person who's supposed to protect you, to bring you back to calm, and then they're injuring you. It feels like there's no one else, there's no one there to help you. So, I'm not going to go into all the different traumas that I have written out there exhaustively for you. I'm just going to touch on a few. One of them is emotional abuse. A lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of us have grown up with some level of emotional abuse in our family. It may sound weird to say that, but at some point, there may have been something there. But the big idea is that we've had a caregiver who we know still loved us, who overall had our best interests in mind. Maybe they just were misinformed about what was best for us. So what emotional abuse can look like is it can look like having unreasonable expectations for kids. So, expecting a 5-year-old to make the meal for your younger siblings, and then yelling at the 5-year-old and telling them, why didn't they do that? Right? That would be emotionally abusive. It's not a reasonable expectation to ask a 5-year-old to make the meal. That has happened. I don't come up with these out of nowhere sometimes. But it can often look like just household chores. Like, if you're in kindergarten, it's reasonable to maybe ask them to make their bed, but expecting it to be perfect the first time, like you as an adult make the bed, and then going back and fixing their bed or telling them, like, this is wrong, you've done it wrong, right? That's an unreasonable expectation for that developmental age. And so what we're really looking at is emotional abuse is oftentimes, they're reasonable expectations, but maybe for a different age group. And it kind of conveys to them that they're wrong or bad, or there's something really at the core wrong with them for getting those things imperfectly done. Sometimes kids are called names, they're sworn at. I don't know, we could go on and on about that, but it's where a child might feel humiliated compared to their siblings and how they don't add up. So as you can tell, I should probably mention, there are many different, if you ever listen to people speak about trauma, you're going to get a lot of different variations on definitions of trauma and what constitutes a trauma. And I'm giving you a very wide range because these small things, like maybe being belittled as a child, we may look at it as like nothing big, but to that child, it can feel like an attack at the very core of who they are. And that can be a perceived threat to their well-being, and they still have the same physiological response. Whether it's a car accident or being bullied at school, is the same physiological response. And I think the other big part about trauma is that it's not only the presence of something bad, right? A car accident, a natural disaster, your mom having depression, maybe being bullied, but it also is the lack of something good. So if you didn't get the emotional attunement, so one of the, some of the things that can happen to kids is just things that a lot of people would never consider is, like a kid will be running down the street and fall and hit their knee. They'll go to the parent, and the parent will just be extremely angry. Why did you go down? I told you not to run. Why'd you run down the street like that? You're going to get hurt. And literally, and even, hit the child or further hurt the child when they're injured, right? That's the presence of something bad. That tells them, man, gosh, I can't wait, I'm hurting, and I can't get help. That's horrible, right? And then you can have a child who grows up in a home where they hit their leg and the mom is so depressed, or the parents are using drugs or alcohol, or they're just not home because they're working, right? And so they hurt themselves and there's no one there to soothe them. There's no one there to take care of their ouchie. And so they still are kind of get stuck in that stress response. Versus a parent who shows empathy, right? Oh, you hurt your knee, you've got a boo-boo, let me see that. Let me take care of your injury, that must hurt. Does that hurt really bad on your knee? Yeah, and so you're reflecting back what you see, you're reflecting back what they probably feel at that moment. You're showing empathy, you're engaging them with your voice and your care, and that is stimulating all sorts of neurons in their bodies and brains to bring them back to regulation. And so, as you can see with that demonstration, that those situations can just look at so many different ways for kids and really impact their development and their ability to come back to rest and digest. So we talked a little bit about substance abuse and how oftentimes that can make a person often turn inward or not be able to attune to their children. Not always. And then mental illness. Sometimes with mental illness, it can look like a flat affect or not being able to respond emotionally to the kid. So that impacts emotional development and awareness and empathy, because we learn empathy through receiving empathy, right? So also if there's mental illness where there's like rage and mood swings, right, that can create this lack of predictability in the environment and just feeling on edge, and that wash of the cortisol on your body because you're just not sure if your mom's going to be happy today or she's going to come in and she's going to start a fight. And so that can really impact a child's ability to cope. And I think one of those that a lot of people don't think about that I just want to mention is frequent moves. So our first thing as kids is, like I talked about, is we just want to make sure we're going to survive first. That's the basic thing. And once we've figured out, okay, we're going to live, we can handle whatever stressor, is we can move on to the other order of functioning. And if a child is picked up and moved often, they have to reorient themselves to their physical environment. And they may not even be oriented to their bodies yet, or their families. But so they're getting all new people, all new stimulation, maybe a different culture if you move across the country. Maybe you're going from an apartment to a house. Maybe your parents go from being stay-at-home parents to not being home at all. They have to learn new caregivers, new churches, new schools, and that all, at first, even though it doesn't seem like survival, because we're adults and we're like, no, it's just different, right? For kids, they have to put their energy in adjusting to this change when they should be putting their energy into developing and growing and just exploring and playing in their safe environment. And so, unfortunately, some of the most, the people that I've seen with a lot of trauma, it's actually been around moving, they were picked up and moved 15 times growing up. And it just didn't allow them to kind of meet the developmental task that they had at that particular age. And so they were just always kind of orienting in that survival mode instead of being able to come back to calm. So it doesn't even seem like that bad, but it just was a big stressor for a kid. So that's kind of all that I wanted to talk about, but I wanted to see if you guys had any questions about those different traumatic events. And, okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the community violence when there's a sentence in here that says sometimes a child only needs to hear about violence to experience trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, in our world of images and how much kids are taking in, is that something they can experience through, say, TV or movies and things like that and internalize it? Or is that more something they would have to know on a personal basis that went through that trauma?
Well, I think there's a couple factors there. Developmentally, right, a preschooler, if you tell them, like, gosh, it's raining cats and dogs, they might look out the window for cats and dogs to be, like, literally raining. They're very realistic and very, their imagination is just really vivid. And so if you tell them something happened, they're going to take that very literally. And so that can be traumatizing to them. The other component is, how close it hits to home. And if, obviously, like if it's a nearby school. I've worked with several people who weren't in Columbine, but they were in a nearby school. And they may not have watched the news, maybe their parents guarded them, but they heard about it. And I think the key with these kind of community tragedies is trying to use language that is appropriate for the kid to understand what happened and to also understand their safety. And trying to just kind of start with what have you heard? What do you understand about this that's happening? And what are your friends saying about this? What do you think about it? And trying to fill in the gaps, because a lot of times if a kid is just kind of hearing about something, they may go into like a worst case scenario and have some sort of rundown about how they're unsafe, when actually you're like, no, they are safe, but they need that reassurance. And they need, again, that they're pretty much saying they're scared and they need your regulation. So it's going to depend on the developmental age, how close they are to the tragedy, how resilient they are to trauma already with their regulation system. So there's definitely some different factors there. But I definitely believe, I think myself, I can remember a specific movie that was traumatizing that really upset me growing up. So I think watching appropriate shows with your kids is really important for you to do, because while you're able to regulate during them, it's really important to make sure they're staying safe and they're regulated and helping them come back to joy and calm. Yeah.
So when you think about resilience, not big things like that, but the small thing about, some kid runs into a wall accidentally and hurts their ankle or hurts their knee or something like that. One thing you could probably see, if this is a kid that does this every single second of every single day, the temptation would be to say, hey, let's be a little more resilient, and I'm not going to come and kiss every little boo-boo.
Right.
Because doing so is going to keep you in some sort of infantile stage and not help you develop that resilience.
Okay.
But it seems like this model is saying, no, the more you come and the more often that you
right.
kiss the boo-boos, the more it's going to help them develop resilience.
Yeah.
Is there balance there? Is one right? Is one wrong? How do you...
So I think that this is the real challenge, is we as a society, we'll go by chronological age and say, you're 8 years old, buck up, man. You should be able to stop running on the wall, you're fine, right? And the chronological age is helpful to keep in mind, but maybe this child is still a toddler due to any, as far as their developmental tasks and not maybe being aware of their bodies. Maybe they're at a lower level of development. And so it would be important for us to give them love and care and soothing so that they can complete that developmental stage and grow up into the next developmental stage and then grow up to the next one. But what often will happen is we get tired. This is freaking tiring, man. And we don't want to wait. We think if a child was neglected the first 3 years, they should be able to be resilient and they should be okay. And we think, well, it looks like they come from a healthy home, so they should be beyond this, right? But your chronological age definitely does not determine your ability to handle stress. As you may notice with people who are twice your age who may not be able to handle stress or things properly, right? You can notice sometimes that happens. So yeah, this model of parenting is very much about attuning to them and trying to allow them to be able to grow and do that in a healthy kind of manner versus oftentimes what the normal traditional parenting can often just basically kind of scare or threaten kids into submission sometimes. Like, you just need to buck up, right? And they're like, okay, this is like my only connection. I must need to buck up and like make them happy so they don't leave me or something, or abuse me or something else, right? So it is a very different way of looking at parenting and development, and it's challenging, and it's so hard because we've all probably grown up with more traditional parenting, and so it's very different to try to change that. But we'll look into that more in a minute too.
Once again, this may not be fitting for what you're doing today, but in a church, we become secondary parties to the parenting. And so the question, I guess, is how can we effectively walk alongside a child that we really truly believe is in trauma?
Yeah.
When we don't see them that often, but they'll come to church and they'll act out like man.
Yeah.
Because there they know they're not going to get smashed or anything like that. So how can we, as third party or secondary parties, help this child with development? How can we walk alongside?
Yeah, and I'll get into that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to open Pandora's box here, but I do have a question in terms of physical abuse and the idea of spanking kids. How do you see those related to trauma? And, I mean, often you hear of well-intentioned parents that spank a kid and the negative results of that or the lack of that. What are your thoughts on that being, with adults who've experienced trauma, and maybe the link between some of those? Is there or is there not?
So children who misbehave, I'm under the impression that their behavior is for a reason. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So maybe I'll go into this more, and maybe we'll come back to that. Could you remind me?
Sure.
Okay. Try to remind me about this, and we'll come back to it. Okay. So the next part here is just, and I didn't put up things that I've got written on your paper. I just will connect with you guys that way. Is just kind of referring you back to your paper. There are possible reactions of children exposed to traumatic stress, and so I've listed them for you here. This is certainly not exhaustive, basically, I want to kind of direct you a little bit further down as to why these behaviors are occurring. And I think that's really the key, even with Kevin's question, even about like running into the wall. A child may realize, if I run into the wall, I'm going to get my teacher to come over and look at me, right? And to that child, that connection, like any connection is better than no connection potentially. So we can't even look at strictly behaviors because there are different reasons for the behavior. Maybe the child gets a rush of chemicals to their body when they get injured, and that feels good and helps them regulate, so that's why they did it. Maybe they got laughs from their friends. That's why they did it. So we want to try to figure out what's underneath that behavior, what role is that having for the child, so that we can figure out how we can come alongside them and help them. And so the next one is why kids have these reactions, is talking about these different behaviors. The reason for these behaviors, there's one of them is developmental issues, just like when I was talking with Kevin. Children may not act their age due to trauma interfering with the completion of developmental tasks and emotional, social, and cognitive difficulties. So you may have, a 12-year-old who's acting like a toddler because he never has completed the developmental tasks that need to happen for him to be able to mature. it could be that their fight, flight, and freeze response is so dysregulated that they're literally living in this fight or flight response. And so it may look like hyperactivity, acting out, yelling, angry, different things like that. And a lot of times ADHD or ADD is often diagnosed when it's trauma. And it's really their body is not learning how to come back down and calm. So, and then the other one is current stressors. So a child may be regulated, right? And just be sitting in the classroom. And then maybe a principal walks in and he's got a really deep voice. And maybe it reminds him of his grandfather who was abusive to him. And suddenly he's up, he's running around, or he's cracking jokes, or he's doing different things. And he likely, it's beyond his awareness. This is a automatic, not intentional response for him to be activated by grandfather, like a grandfather type figure walking in. And he's just going wild because he is reenacting the states that he was in during that original trauma. He's maybe having even body sensations from the original trauma. He could be feeling the same emotions that he felt during the trauma. He could be, it could cause him to dissociate if he went into the freeze response, and then he could just shut down and he could just forget the lesson completely. So the big idea is that it automatically happens, and it could cause a person to go into a trauma reaction, causing these, and it can look like these behaviors that I mentioned here. Do you guys have any questions or thoughts about, so you can kind of even, if you look at this sheet here, you can look at, I wonder what this child is doing if they're in a temper tantrum, right? Maybe they're feeling really scared and they don't know how to express that. And the only thing they know how to do is just start crying and throwing things. A lot of times anger is a secondary emotion. That means there's an emotion beneath it that they don't know how to handle, but they sure as heck know how to show anger, and that's going to get someone's attention to come over and help them. Or to scare them into not being angry anymore. But this behavior is trying to teach and tell you something about this child and their internal world so that they can actually get the help that they need. Does that make sense?
I do have a question, like how do we best like accommodate that or respond to that without kind of further harming them? Like I have several high school students who you just described even in that kind of response of like either like extreme kind of humor or silliness during a really serious kind of moment, or kind of suddenly feeling really emotional or not able to control themselves physically. What, you know, sometimes I'll be giving a lesson too, and this will be happening. How can we kind of, you know, how do we kind of control that or respond to that in a way that doesn't hurt them?
You know, I think it's really tough because we don't have trauma-informed schools very much. And there are trauma-informed schools out there which would give kids like an ability to do what they need to help calm themselves down, or go find the support that they need elsewhere. I think that the big picture that I would remind you when they're acting out is it's not intentional. It's oftentimes outside of their awareness of why they're feeling badly, and they're dysregulated and they're not able to hear your logic. They're not able to hear your lectures. They're not often able to inhibit the behaviors that they want to inhibit because, again, that neocortex that inhibits behaviors and helps you understand people is offline. So it oftentimes looks like getting down to their level, trying to connect. I see you're having a really hard time right now. What's going on, right? If you have that time and space in your classroom to connect with them. So think about, I feel like when you're thinking about helping people regulate, is the same kinds of things that regulate babies, like being close to them, that sing-song kind of voice, your tone, your facial expressions, creating a safe environment. Those are the really just first steps to start helping them to calm down. But I think the bigger picture would be trying to look at your organization or your classroom and trying to instill policies that are going to support kids who are dysregulated or have a trauma background. So I know I didn't answer that exactly probably how you wanted, but okay, okay, cool. Any other questions?
I have a related to what Kevin said. When you have a child that you're trying to empathize with, really meet them where they are at in their trauma, but they're also more of in that defeatist, I've failed at something and so now therefore it's the end of the world type thing. How do you do that, making that connection and empathy, but reframing for them without dismissing
Right.
where they're at?
Yeah. I think the big picture that I would encourage you to think about is just really being an empathic kind of mirror. I would just say, yeah, you feel like this is just, you should just give up. No, there's no point. And I bet it feels even worse than that. And just staying with the horrible feeling, being present with them, and just giving yourself more time than you'd ever guess before you maybe suggest something else, like, why don't we take a walk? So if they're in the collapse, the freeze state, let's get some movement going. Let's toss a ball back and forth. Just be present with them in that. Does that help a little bit? Okay.
I had a question for everybody in here. I'm just wondering if you've done something in your job, not with your own children, but as within your ministry or within your school, that has worked for you. I'm just curious
Yeah.
to hear from you guys if anything's worked when dealing with either of these kind of situations. Prayer.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think the big thing, I think if you're just a community member, a pastor, a leader for a youth group or ministry leader, I think the big idea, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more, is being just a safe person to reflect their emotions back to them, of connecting with your heart and with your relationship, with your attunement, with your voice, and not trying to fix them, not to try to tell them that they're wrong, not judging them, but that presence is something that a lot of people don't get. I'm always surprised. I'll just be present with someone, and they're like, oh my gosh, I haven't had someone just listen to me for, like weeks. And a lot of times kids don't get that presence either. And it really can be enough if they have one safe person in their life, just how much resiliency that can add to a child's life. So you may think you're a teacher, what good are you going to do? But the way that you're interacting with them does register, and it can be just infinitely more powerful than you'd ever imagine. Yeah. Okay, so, and the key about, these are oftentimes traumatic, like I said, traumatic responses. It's not exhaustive, but as I mentioned, I forget your name.
It's hard to remember, it's Clarine.
Clarine. As I mentioned to Clarine, we can actually heal trauma. It's not something that needs to stay there forever. PTSD is not a diagnosis that you need to have forever, actually. It's something that you can heal. And one of the things is you can do as well as caregivers or different kind of people in the community is helping them to develop a coherent story of what has happened, right? So maybe a school shooting happened, trying to get an impression of what they understood, appropriately fill in the blanks. And so, yeah, today you were at school and you heard about a school shooting, and then you felt really scared and your stomach felt sick. So you want to be thinking about that brainstem, your sensations, thinking about your emotions in this story, and also what actually happened to help them to integrate that all. You're getting your whole brain at work. So you're getting you're putting a story together because trauma is fragmenting for the memory. And so you can tell the story. You heard about a school shooting and you got scared and your stomach got upset and you started crying and you guys talked about it at your school and then you went to lunch, blah, blah, blah. Then you came home and you're safe. And this is what we're doing at your school to help with your safety. And basically the whole story through, you're kind of allowing them to, and they may need to tell that story 100 times for that child to get the message that they're safe and they're okay. They may need to draw a book about what happened when they, flipped over their handlebars on a bike because they're just worried about riding their bike again. So basically you help them to come to a coherent story to help resolve the trauma. And you can, that's also where you can get an excellent play therapist or art therapist for kids. You can also get a great just therapist for adolescents to help reprocess the trauma. So one of the ways you can look at PTSD re-experiencing, flashbacks, all the emotional things that can come up is that our body is telling us there's something that we have to heal from the past. There is something here for us to see. And so these different trauma reactions are really a cry for help of healing. And so really getting that person, that kid, encouraging them to get a therapist would be wonderful. But making sure they have community support, teachers who understand this behavior from a trauma perspective. These are all really important things. So, all right, I have about 10 or 15 minutes. All right, so this is the next part I think you guys really wanted to get to. And I'm sorry that this is, I'm going to turn off the lights so you can read this a little bit better. Tell me if that still allows you to. I know it's not the best. But as you can see here, this is our non-trauma informed parenting. These are often just how we normally have been parented and how people tend to parent their children. And you can see that oftentimes there's a power dynamic, and so the parents trying to input their authority over their kids versus empowering kids. So that looks very different, right? You need to put your shoes on, or you can choose your shoes. You can either put your red shoes on or your blue shoes, or you need to put your pants and shoes on. Which one would you like to go first? So there's a lot of different things. I'm not going to go through all these, but a lot of times there's a lot of judgment in bad behaviors, right? Like if a kid acts up bad, if a kid is suffering and having different behavioral issues, lying, different things like that, we'll judge the behavior, label it as bad, and the child often internalizes that into their own being versus observing and trying to figure out what's behind the behavior, how can we help them. Gosh, there's a lot here. So we can often look at behavior as right or wrong versus what the actual behavior is doing to help this child in that moment of need. And that there are multiple ways of looking at this. Goodness, there's a lot here. Do you guys have any questions about those that don't make sense? How about that?
So I'm thinking about this in a bigger context.
Yeah.
Theological context.
Yeah.
Human stuff.
Yes.
That's very much typically when it's conceived of as willful defiance.
Yes.
Right, is over on the left-hand column.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it were sin, it's conceived of something like maybe brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be more on the right hand. Whereas God brings healing
Right.
instead of something maybe over further on the left-hand side.
Right, right.
How do you think as a therapist do things like that?
So what I think about is God designed us to be in happy, like in families where our parents attuned to us and loved us and cared about us. And that instills a sense of joy and love in our hearts. And so our actions are out of joy in general. Not always, but in general, they're not out of fear, which is when you're dysregulated, when you're in fight or flight, that is definitely motivated by fear. And so I think that ideally, with the sin perspective, it works if you did have a loving home more, but a lot of people may have developmental issues, or it inherently feels sad, bad, wrong, and be operating out of a fear perspective, which is right, like the one thing that God tells us not to do is to fear, but we're like operating it out of there. So I guess the way that I comprehend this is that on the left-hand side, we're trying to be like God with us, right? We're trying to impart on the people that we're with that we love them and we care for them no matter their behavior. On this side, on the non-trauma informed, it tends to come off as, I love you if you obey me. And that's not God. He loves us whether we obey him or not. But I think it's not as simple as I just broke it down for, but that's, I guess, kind of how I conceptualize and think about it. What do you think?
I'm not sure, that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's something we really have to wrestle with in about sin and what the role of sin is here. But I think sin is missing the mark, and it causes bad behaviors, or if we want to, misbehaviors, things that are hurtful to other people. And we can, chastise people for it, or we can try to help them heal from it so they don't continue doing it. And that's kind of where I'm at.
Just kind of along that line though, let's say for instance, when you're in a group of young people, and one of them is carrying trauma, and their behavior is impacting the other group, then there has to be at some point in time an intervention that prevents the impact on the other group.
Oh, definitely. Safety first.
Going back to the idea of trauma, if they've not experienced joy, my experience in walking with some kids is that if you can work with them long enough and get them to a place where they have an experience of joy and they begin to understand what that feeling is like, then they can begin to reconnect.
Yes. Yes.
Their behaviors.
Yes.
And the impact that the behaviors have at a different level. But there has to be persistence in walking with them until they reach a place where they actually experience it themselves.
Definitely. Joy.
So that to me is the difference between sin and something else.
Right, yeah.
Sin is the absence of joy.
Right, yeah. I think that's huge. That's what we're doing when we're taking kids out of fight or flight and rest and digest, is we're happy to be with them. We're completely present with them right here, right now. And that attunement helps them, and knowing that we love them and we care for them. That's what brings them back to joy and instills hope, and I can do this, I can get through this. And it changes your behavior when you have that felt sense of I matter, I care, someone cares about me, someone enjoys me. Some kids have never had that because they're just, their parents are just worried about their behavior and getting their behavior to be in line.
I think maybe some of the tension between this is if we knew, they're acting this way or what we're seeing is because of trauma, I think that makes it a lot easier to be empathetic, to kind of meet them where they're at and give that grace, versus saying, like you're saying, they're just being a knucklehead, or this is willful behavior, trauma, that unconscious, whatever, but sometimes there is just willful behavior with it. Do you have tools for us who aren't professionals of not going into hour-long therapy sessions to get at has there been trauma? Because often it looks the same, I think, externally. But are there ways for us to kind of be, I think this might be due to some trauma, or that might be some of the root things going on? Or is it pretty much impossible just on the surface, so therefore we should react, assuming that there could be something going on?
I think you don't want to ask them about trauma unless you have a really safe and a space to actually go into it. And trauma, the thing about it is a lot of times people might have a recollection somewhat of an assault, and they can tell you 1,000 times about the assault that occurred to them, but it doesn't change their PTSD symptoms. Why is that? Because logical linear, your words, that's in the neocortex. trauma is stored in your brainstem, in your emotional brain. There are very few pathways going from the front to the deeper parts of the brain, but there's really a ton of pathways going from the bottom up. And so when we're trying to heal trauma as a trauma therapist, is I'm doing a bottom-up approach, which can be EMDR, can be brain spotting, can be play therapy, but it's not something where if a child tells you what happened, they're gonna stop the behavior, because there's actually like a deep healing that would need to occur. So I think it's a good frame to have. And I think if you have the connection with a parent, that you can say, hey, I noticed that, he's reacting out of, this fear. He really struggles with transitions. Maybe that would be helpful to have him, talk with someone about, because he seems to be really, fearful or uncomfortable or on edge. And that's something that I think could benefit him. It's really tough because obviously our culture is not really like pro-therapy very often. So if you say like, hey, your child could benefit from therapy, they may be insulted. But if you feel really passionate and you feel you have the connection with them, I think I would just, try to talk about it and make that an option and do the best that you can. Okay, so that's...
Actually, just being able to share some information that you get as well.
Right, you can just talk to them about the body's stress response. Right, exactly. This isn't rocket science, and there's so much out there to help families and schools and organizations to be trauma informed. It's amazing.
The one thing I would say, though, is to be cautious when you're doing that, because you can't make assumption that the parent isn't the one causing the trauma.
Right, exactly. That's a tough thing, is the very caregiver could be actually traumatizing, and oftentimes they'll be really resistant and angry if you tell them about it, right? I am sorry this isn't more clear, but the quick and dirty a little bit more is first, make sure they're not going to hurt themselves or someone else. If they're kind of caught in one of these behaviors, make sure that you create some space for them where they do feel safe. So they can go to the restroom, there could be a part of your classroom, there could be a place in your house that's really safe for the kids. So timeouts sometimes can be helpful if they're overwhelmed and they are older and they have the ability to self-soothe. But oftentimes for little kids, timeouts can be really detrimental to their development. And you may want to do a time in and be present with them and help them to come back to regulation. Because little toddlers, oftentimes, they just keep skyrocketing into more dysregulation until you come in and you help them. Regulate the nervous system. So really the idea, like I mentioned, with regulating the nervous system is attunement, is being present with them. If they're in the frozen response, you can get them to move a little bit. If they're hyperactive, you can do some breathing exercises with them. You can help them to get really present with their body and the present moment and tune to their environment, that maybe they are safe, even when they felt unsafe in the past, if a traumatic memory has come up. The biggest thing here is none of this behavior is gonna change. These kids aren't gonna grow and thrive unless there's really connected relationships. Unless you have the safety in your relationship, you're probably not going to see the change that you want to see and have these kids grow up to be happy, healthy individuals. As I mentioned, support development of a coherent narrative. So structures, routine, presence of reliable adults, that all helps to reduce the chaos that a child might feel and allow them to start creating the kind of logical sequential connections that not only help them understand their own narrative, but also the fundamental requirement of many types of learning. So there's a lot of resources too I've put up here, which will go into more about helping more specifically kids with trauma, but being able to talk through it and put words to these things that kids don't have access to the words yet would be really important. Practice power with strategy. So one of the hallmarks of trauma is a loss of power and control. When someone is wielding power over you with no regard to your thoughts or feelings, the toxic shame of the original trauma may come flooding back, As adults, we should use our power well. If we model a power relationship with children, it's our best chance of creating adults who will treat others with dignity and respect. So that's that whole idea of not trying to dominate kids and tell them what's wrong or right, but trying to empower them to see their giftings, to see their skills, to give them options. And that's going to help them feel that sense that they can change the world, that their voice matters, these things that maybe they hadn't gotten when they were little babies, like I talked about with development. Build social and emotional resiliency skills. Since trauma doesn't allow you to really connect with your emotions and social development, we're really going to have to work on helping these kids reconnect socially and emotionally. And I'm going to breeze through this last one since we have to go. Foster positive post-traumatic growth. So there's just a lot that you can do to build resiliency, build problem-solving skills, planning, maintaining focus. Basically, all those executive functionings of your prefrontal cortex, you can actually, when they're school age, help build into that and develop those skills further. So that's some more kind of rundown, but I put in more details in your handout. I think the biggest thing for you is you as a parent, the only way you can regulate a child without scaring them into submission or freeze is through your own regulation. If you're triggered by a child's behavior, that might be something that you could journal about later, you can see a therapist for, but basically you want to heal your own wounds so that you can be present to theirs and help them to grow and be healthy individuals. So I think that's everything I've got, but
I don't believe that's true.
for today, I know I kind of went over a little bit here, but yeah, hopefully that was helpful for you guys.